I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. I started right after dropping out of school, back when life in my small town didn't seem to be leading anywhere. At the time, driving on the open roads felt like freedom, and I loved the solitude of long hauls. Today, at 38, I'm still at it, but things have changed. Driving through the night, especially on deserted highways, never bothered me until that night. It was one of those quiet, almost dull routes, cutting through miles of road surrounded by dense trees on both sides. The moon was high, and the only light aside from it came from my truck's headlights. I remember glancing at the clock, 3:27 a.m. I thought I was alone out there, or at least I hoped I was. The night was eerily quiet. Even the radio didn't want to cooperate, just static between stations. To pass the time, I chewed on an old piece of gum I found in the glove compartment and started counting the reflectors along the road. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, but it made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a cry. At first I thought I was imagining things. The truck's engine made enough noise, and exhaustion does funny things to your mind. But as I slowed down around a curve, the sound became clearer. It was the cry of a child coming from the darkness beside the road. It didn't make sense, but something made me ease off the gas and eventually stop. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder, my heart racing. Grabbing my flashlight, I hesitated before stepping down from the cab. The highway was empty, and the trees seemed even thicker than usual. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, but only so far. I took a few steps toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from a small gap in the woods. Each step made the crying sound closer, but I still couldn't see anyone. It was muffled, weak, like the child was trying not to draw too much attention. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice came out shakier than I'd intended, and the silence that followed was worse. The crying stopped abruptly. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. A strange chill ran through me, and in that moment, every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck. But I was curious, or maybe just stubborn. I stood there for a few seconds, staring into the blackness. That's when I heard it, the snap of a branch. The sound came from deep in the woods where the flashlight couldn't reach. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest. "Is someone there?" I called out again, louder this time. No response. Just the sound of the wind rustling the trees and, far in the distance, my truck's engine still running. That was it. I decided I wasn't going to stick around. Turning back, I aimed the flashlight at the ground and walked briskly toward the cab. That's when the real nightmare began. As I walked back to the truck, an eerie feeling began to creep over me, like I was being watched. My steps quickened almost without me realizing it, and every little sound around me felt amplified. Leaves rustling, the wind through the branches. When I finally reached the cab, I climbed in quickly, locking the door behind me. I exhaled, trying to calm myself down. "It's probably just an animal," I told myself, even though it didn't make much sense. I turned on the high beams and aimed them toward where the crying had come from, but all I saw was darkness between the trees. The sound was completely gone, but the unease lingered, as though something was still out there. That's when I looked in the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. Standing at the edge of the road, right behind the truck, was a child. I couldn't make out the details of their face, but it looked like a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a white shirt that reflected the glow of the taillights. He didn't move or blink. He just stood there, staring at the truck. For a moment, I thought maybe he was lost, but something felt off. There was something in his eyes, or rather, the lack of expression in them. I couldn't see clearly, but it was as if there was no emotion at all. That terrified me. Without thinking, I slammed on the gas to get out of there as quickly as I could. The road ahead was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My chest felt tight, and my hands were so sweaty I could barely grip the wheel. What scared me the most was the silence. There was no sound except for the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, hoping the boy would be gone. He wasn't there anymore. My heart jumped, a mix of relief and dread. But the fear came back when, suddenly, I heard a metallic thud from the back of the truck, like something had hit the cargo area. My stomach churned. There was no way anyone could have climbed onto the truck while I was driving. Something was seriously wrong. I pulled over again, my hands shaking. Slowly, I got out of the truck, flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other, as if that would protect me from whatever was out there. I walked toward the back of the truck, feeling every beat of my racing heart. When I got to the cargo area, I found nothing. There was no sign of anyone, nothing that could explain the noise I had heard. Still, the sensation of being watched was so overwhelming that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors again, feeling utterly helpless. It was as if I was no longer in control of the situation. I tried to keep driving, but my hands were trembling so much that it was hard to keep the truck steady on the road. My mind was racing with questions. Who was that child? How did he end up there? And more importantly, how did he disappear so quickly? As my brain spun with these thoughts, I started to hear a strange sound coming from inside the cab. It was like heavy breathing, but it wasn't mine. The sound seemed to come from behind me, like someone was sitting in the passenger seat. My eyes stayed glued to the windshield, and it took every ounce of courage I had to glance at the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I was going to pass out. In the reflection, I saw a shadow. It wasn't the boy, but something even stranger. The shape seemed to twist and writhe, as if it were trying to take on a human form but couldn't quite manage it. It was dark, almost solid, but there was an emptiness about it that was deeply unsettling. I turned around so fast I almost yanked the steering wheel, but the passenger seat was empty. The shadow was gone. I started breathing harder, sweat dripping down my forehead. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get away from that place as fast as possible. The nearest town was far, but I decided to drive to the next gas station, no matter how long it took. After about 20 minutes, I saw the lights of a small gas station on the horizon. It was an old place with a single pump and an office that looked more like a makeshift cabin. I parked the truck and turned off the engine, feeling the oppressive silence settle around me again. The attendant was an older man, thin, with white hair and tired eyes. When I walked in, he looked at me for a moment, as if he could tell something was wrong. "You okay, son?" he asked in a raspy voice. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words didn't come out right. "Have you seen anything strange on the road?" I asked, almost pleading for an explanation. He frowned and took a while to answer. "This isn't the first time I've heard something like that around here," he finally said. "People talk about a boy showing up on these roads, but nobody knows who or what he really is." My heart was pounding. It was like everything suddenly made sense and didn't at the same time. He continued, "If I were you, I wouldn't stop on these roads at night. Strange things happen." I thanked him, though my mind was still spinning. I bought a coffee to steady my nerves and went back to the truck. As I turned on the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, dreading what I might see. The drive to my next stop was tense. Every little sound felt magnified, and I couldn't stop thinking about what the attendant had said. As I drove, I avoided looking at the mirrors too much, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally saw the lights of the city in the distance, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as if the oppressive presence of the highway had stayed behind. I parked at a cargo depot and turned off the truck. Dawn was breaking, the sky painted in shades of orange. Even though I was exhausted, I couldn't relax. After filing some paperwork, I sat in the cab for a while, staring at the horizon. That's when I noticed something on the windshield. There was a small handprint, too small to belong to an adult. What chilled me the most was that it looked like it had appeared on the inside, not the outside. I wiped at the glass, but the print didn't disappear. It was like a faint, ghostly imprint. Since that night, I've avoided isolated roads after dark. I've never seen or heard anything like it again, but the memory lingers. Sometimes, when I tell this story to other truckers, I get looks of disbelief, but some of them seem to recognize something, as if they've had similar experiences. I still don't know what that thing was, but one thing I've learned: there are things out on the roads that we'll never understand. And if you hear something strange in the middle of the night, it's probably best not to stop. Sometimes it's better to leave what's out there alone. I've been a delivery driver for about 8 years, always driving trucks through urban and suburban routes. At the time, my life was pretty stable, nothing too exciting, but nothing terrible either. The routine was straightforward: load the truck at dawn, drive to the depots, and usually head back home in the evening. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. That particular day, a Tuesday, I had a simple delivery to make to a warehouse downtown. The kind of place where everything is in constant motion: loaders, forklifts, and the never-ending echo of engines roaring in narrow streets. While I was waiting for the truck to be unloaded, I noticed a man loitering near my trailer. He looked homeless, worn-out clothes, a jacket that was far too big for his skinny frame, and an unfocused gaze like he was searching for something. He kept circling around, glancing at the truck, but never getting too close. I found it odd, but I didn't give it much thought. People like him were always around, looking for scraps of food or just a place to hide from the cold. Once the unloading was done, I did a final check of the truck and saw that the man wasn't around anymore. I started the engine and headed for my next delivery. The first hour on the road was uneventful. Traffic was moderate, and the city seemed to be waking up with the sunrise. But then, as I was driving down a busy avenue, I heard a muffled noise coming from the back. It sounded like a thump-thump, as if someone was pounding their fists against metal. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Trucks make all sorts of weird noises: the suspension, the weight of the cargo, things like that. But as I kept driving, the sounds persisted, and they seemed to be coming from inside the cargo hold. I pulled over onto the shoulder, a bit annoyed, thinking something might have come loose back there. Following protocol, I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the truck, and walked to the back. When I opened the trailer door, a chill ran down my spine. The boxes were all neatly in place, stacked exactly as they had been, but there was something there that shouldn't have been: handprints. They were pressed into the dusty floor of the trailer, fresh enough that I could see the fingers clearly, like someone had been there just moments ago. But the trailer was completely empty. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the handprints on the floor, trying to make sense of it. It was impossible not to think about the man I had seen earlier near the truck. But how could he have gotten inside? The trailer had a security lock, and I was sure the seal was intact when I left the warehouse. Even so, the feeling that something was off kept growing. The silence inside the cargo hold felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air itself was thicker. I found myself shining the flashlight into every corner, half expecting and half dreading to see someone hiding there. But there was no one. I got back into the cab, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the handprints were from one of the loaders at the warehouse, or someone had touched the floor before I picked up the truck. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. I started the engine and continued driving, but now every little noise made me jump. Even the sound of the wheels rolling over bumps in the road seemed amplified. At every turn, I glanced at the side mirrors, expecting to see something or someone moving where they shouldn't be. Of course, I never saw anything, but that just made it all the more unsettling. As the morning went on, the noises in the trailer came back. This time they were softer, almost like something was sliding or dragging across the floor. My mind began to race with all kinds of scenarios. Could it be an animal? A rat, maybe? Or even a stray cat? But it was hard to believe something so small could make such distinct sounds. Either way, I knew I needed to get to the next stop and check again, but the anxiety was eating me alive. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything that could explain what was happening. When I finally reached the next delivery location, I got out of the truck with my heart pounding. This time, I opened the trailer doors with more urgency, almost ripping the security seal off. As soon as the doors swung open, I was met with that same eerie emptiness. The boxes were still in place, but something was different. There was a trail in the dust on the floor, like something or someone had crawled from one end of the trailer to the space between the larger boxes where it was harder to see. I stood at the entrance, shining my flashlight inside, but again, there was no one. A strange smell lingered in the air, faint but metallic, and it suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. That metallic smell was strong, making my throat burn, but what really unsettled me was the feeling of being watched. I stood at the entrance of the trailer, shining the flashlight around, when I heard a faint noise, like a short, muffled breath. That was enough to make me step back, my eyes locked on the darkest corner of the cargo hold. I gripped the flashlight tightly and thought about shouting, asking if someone was there, but the words were stuck in my throat. The silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic, was unbearable. Finally, I mustered the courage to climb into the trailer, moving the light slowly over the boxes. Every step seemed louder than usual, and the trail in the dust led me to the back of the cargo hold. When I got to the end, I saw that the trail stopped at a narrow space between two stacks of boxes. It seemed impossible for anyone to have squeezed in there, but the way the dust was disturbed told me otherwise. I moved one of the boxes, my hands shaking, and my heart nearly stopped when something fell to the floor with a dull thud. It was a crushed soda can, still dented, like someone had been gripping it tightly. I picked up the can and stepped out of the trailer, looking around as if expecting someone to come running. But the loading yard was completely empty. That metallic smell seemed to cling to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even out there in broad daylight. I tossed the can onto the ground and decided to finish the delivery as quickly as possible. The unloading process went by fast, but the tension I felt dragged on forever. Once the trailer was empty, I checked it again, and there were no more trails, no handprints, nothing. It was like everything had vanished into thin air. As I got back into the cab, still feeling on edge, I noticed something hanging from the rear-view mirror, a dirty piece of cloth tied loosely. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there before. I carefully took it down, noticing the strong smell of rust mixed with sweat, and realized it was torn from some kind of jacket. That's when it hit me, the man I'd seen earlier that day. He hadn't just been hanging around the truck. Somehow, he'd gotten inside and left that piece of cloth as some kind of reminder or warning. But what did he want? And why had he disappeared so quickly? I couldn't continue the rest of the route without paranoia setting in. Every corner I turned, every red light I stopped at, I found myself glancing in the mirrors or over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone moving where they shouldn't be. That piece of cloth sat on the passenger seat like a physical weight in my mind. I felt torn between wanting to finish the day quickly and the constant fear that something worse might happen. Despite my anxiety, the rest of the delivery went smoothly. No strange noises, no signs of anything unusual. It was almost as if the whole ordeal had ended, but I knew it wasn't that simple. When I returned to the depot at the end of the day, I decided to tell my supervisor what had happened. He listened with a skeptical expression, as if he thought I was blowing things out of proportion. Noises in the trailer? Handprints? Probably just a cat or a rat. Happens all the time, he said, his tone dismissive and almost mocking. I showed him the piece of cloth, hoping it would make him take me seriously, but he just shrugged and said it was probably trash I hadn't noticed before. Frustrated, I didn't push the issue. There was no point arguing with someone who clearly didn't believe me. That night, when I finally got home, I thought I could relax and put the whole experience behind me. But as soon as I opened my apartment door, that smell hit me again. That metallic, rusty smell, mixed with something sour, clung to the air and made my stomach turn. I stood in the doorway, looking around my dimly lit apartment, where the only light came from the street lamps outside. Nothing seemed out of place, but the smell lingered, like a reminder that the day's events weren't over. I slammed the door shut and sat on the couch, trying to calm my breathing. Then I heard it, a single, heavy step from the hallway outside. I froze, my heart racing, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door right away. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear anything else. When the sound didn't repeat, I finally mustered the courage to swing the door open. The hallway was empty, just as I'd feared and expected. But on the floor, right in front of my door, was the same piece of cloth I'd left in the truck, now neatly folded as if it were some kind of gift. I don't know who or what was following me, but that was the last time I heard or saw anything unusual. Still, to this day, every time I hear a strange noise in my apartment or catch a faint metallic smell, I'm reminded of that day. I have no idea what really happened, but one thing is for sure, I'll never underestimate what might be lurking, just waiting for a chance to strike. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years now, and for the most part, I enjoy it. I travel alone, listen to music or podcasts, and the world outside is just a blur of ever-changing scenery. It was a regular Tuesday night, somewhere on a forgotten stretch of highway in Kansas. I was hauling a load of auto parts, nothing exciting. The road was one of those desolate ones, with miles of open fields and the occasional crumbling barn. I was behind schedule and trying to make up for lost time, but then the one thing every trucker dreads happened. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I turned off the radio and tried restarting the engine, but it was no use. Just the suffocating silence of the night, broken only by the wind whipping through the empty fields around me. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out of the truck to take a look. The road was so dark it felt like an endless black ribbon, with the stars as my only company. The engine didn't show anything obvious. No leaks, no smoke, no loose wires. I called my company's emergency hotline, but they told me the nearest mechanic wouldn't get there for another 3 or 4 hours. The idea of being alone out there for that long didn't sit well with me, but I didn't have much of a choice. As I waited, I heard a faint sound in the distance, the low rumble of an engine drawing closer. A pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, the only sign of life on that deserted road. As the vehicle approached, I saw it was an old battered van, its paint peeling and its bumpers dented. The driver pulled over on the opposite side of the road, stepped out, and waved. He was a thin man, middle-aged, wearing a dirty cap and sporting a scruffy beard that looked more neglected than styled. "Need some help?" he asked with a friendly smile, though something about the way he spoke made me slightly uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it. "It's just the engine," I said, trying to sound casual. "I've already called for assistance, but they're a few hours out." He nodded as if he understood, but didn't leave. Instead, he started asking me questions. Where I was coming from, where I was headed, what I was hauling. I answered vaguely, but he seemed too interested in the details. When I asked where he was from, he hesitated, like he was making up an answer. "Oh, I live in town, about 15 minutes from here," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the darkness. But I knew the closest town was at least 30 miles away. The uneasiness I felt before started turning into a low hum of alarm. That inconsistency kept gnawing at me as he kept talking. His manner was friendly enough, but something felt off. I couldn't quite pin it down. He offered to take a look at the engine, and I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. After all, maybe he really was just trying to help. He walked over to the hood with a tiny flashlight that barely lit anything and started fiddling with the cables. "I think I know what's wrong," he muttered, but his tone sounded more like he was talking to himself than to me. Then he turned back to me with a wide smile, his yellowish teeth catching the dim light. I could try fixing it, but it might take some time. Something about that felt like an excuse to stick around longer than necessary. I thanked him, but told him I'd rather wait for the company mechanic. He shrugged and stepped back, still holding his flashlight. Suit yourself, but staying out here alone at this hour, it's not safe, you know. He said it casually, but every word seemed to carry extra weight. It wasn't exactly a threat, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. What do you mean, not safe? I asked, trying to sound confident. He shook his head and let out a short laugh. Oh, things happen around here. People go missing. Always stories, you know how it is. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't tell if he was joking or being serious, but the conversation was heading in a direction I didn't like. I decided to cut the interaction short. Look, I appreciate you stopping, but I'll be fine. Help's already on the way. He stared at me for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he gave me a crooked smile and said, "All right then, good luck." He started walking back toward his van, but he didn't get in right away. Instead, he stood on the other side of the road, hands in his pockets, just watching me. The sensation of being watched was suffocating, and I had no idea what to do. I could have gotten back into my truck and locked the doors, but the thought of sitting there with him outside made me even more uneasy. Then I noticed something. He was talking, quietly, almost under his breath. But there was no one else there. My mind began to race. Was he talking to himself? Or was someone else in the van? I forced myself to look at the vehicle, but the windows were so filthy I couldn't see a thing inside. What I did know was that this man wasn't leaving. My discomfort turned into genuine fear when he suddenly started walking back toward me. "Look, I've been thinking," he said, his tone firmer now. "Maybe it's better if you come with me to town. It's dangerous to stay here." My heart was pounding. I didn't want to get in that van for even a second, but I also didn't want to provoke him. "No, really, I'm fine waiting," I repeated, trying to sound calm, though my voice was shaking. He narrowed his eyes, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't here to help. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back. That's when I realized I still had my flashlight in hand, and without thinking, I pointed it directly at him. His face lit up partially, and I saw something that sent a chill through my entire body. His eyes. They were locked on me, but there was something wrong. They didn't have the natural shine of a person's eyes, almost like they were lifeless. Maybe it was the angle of the light or just my imagination, but at that moment, it didn't matter. Fear gripped me entirely. "All right," he finally said, stepping back a bit. "But you really should think about it. Staying out here can be dangerous." The way he repeated that word, dangerous, sent shivers down my spine. He finally walked back to the van, but to my surprise, he didn't start the engine. Instead, he just sat there with the lights off. I could feel his eyes on me through the windshield. The tense silence was almost unbearable, and I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my pocket, but there was virtually no signal in this area. Still, I pulled it out and pretended to make a call. "Yeah, I'm here on the highway," I said, loud enough for him to hear. "The mechanic should be here any minute. Thanks for coming so quickly." I hoped that would be enough to convince him I wasn't entirely alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the van's door creak open again. This time, he stepped out holding something in his hand. From a distance, it was hard to tell what it was, but it looked like a club, or maybe a tool of some kind. My heart almost stopped. "What are you doing?" I yelled, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't answer. He just kept walking toward my truck, clutching that object. That's when I made a decision. I ran to the passenger side, climbed into the truck, and locked the doors. I grabbed a tire iron I kept in the side compartment and sat in the driver's seat, clutching it tightly, convincing myself I was safe inside. He knocked on the window once, then again in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound was maddening. And then, just like that, he stopped. I looked out the window, and he was standing there, staring directly at me. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back to the van. The engine finally roared to life, and he drove off, but not quickly. The van crept down the highway until it disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but silence. My whole body was trembling, but I didn't move for what felt like forever. When the mechanic finally arrived, I could barely explain what had happened. I just told him to fix the truck as fast as he could. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I've never driven that stretch of road again. And every time I see an old van, my stomach twists into knots. I've been a trucker for over 15 years. I've always loved the freedom of the road, the solitary hours with nothing but the hum of the engine and the world passing by in a blur. It was early November, about 2 years ago, when I took a night route through the Appalachian Mountains. The winding roads, surrounded by towering trees and jagged peaks, were familiar to me, but that night felt different. The air was heavy, and a strange sense of unease settled over me the moment I left the depot. I brushed it off as just another long haul, nothing I hadn't handled before. The fog started rolling in after I had been driving for hours, far from any sign of civilization. It wasn't just any fog, it was the kind that swallows everything around you, dampening sound and sight alike. I slowed down, switched on the fog lights, but it barely made a difference. The radio played static in the background, a faint noise that filled the silence. But then I noticed something odd. Beneath the static, there was something else. At first, it was subtle, almost like a trick of the mind, but it became more distinct as the minutes passed. I fiddled with the dial, thinking it was just interference, but no station came through clearly. "Must be the fog messing with the signal," I muttered, trying to shake the growing unease. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Long hours on the road can do that. But no, the sound was real. A whisper, faint but deliberate, echoing in the cab. I couldn't make out what it said, but it was persistent, coming from somewhere behind me. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the darkness of the trailer behind me. My chest tightened, and I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a draft sneaking through the seals of the doors. But it didn't sound like wind. It sounded human. I turned up the radio to drown it out, but the tension in the cab only grew thicker. Then I saw it. Something moved alongside the truck, quick and shadowy, too fast to be an animal, too large to be a bird. My gaze snapped back to the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind me. The shadow lingered in the fog, keeping pace with the truck at a steady distance. My heart raced as I stared, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the headlights. But deep down, I knew better. The radio crackled again, and this time, a voice broke through the static. "Don't look back." The words sent an icy chill down my spine, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter, afraid of what might happen if I disobeyed. My whole body tensed when I heard those words. Don't look back. It was impossible to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was there. Still, I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. The voice on the radio was low and raspy, distant, but filled with a sense of urgency that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was just interference, some random broadcast picked up by the frequency. Even so, I turned off the radio, but the silence that followed was even worse. It felt like the cab was alive, the air around me vibrating with something I couldn't see. All I could hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat. The fog grew thicker, and the once empty road began to feel like an endless tunnel, walled in by shadows shifting through the trees. Every instinct screamed at me to stop the truck, but a deeper fear told me that stopping would only make things worse. I pressed on, ignoring the creeping sensation that the truck was slowing down, as if something heavy was pulling it backward. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, just to make sure the trailer was secure, and that's when I saw it. For a split second, something pale glimmered in the darkness, a face staring directly at me. My hand slipped on the wheel, and the truck swerved slightly before I regained control. "It's just your mind playing tricks," I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded weaker than I intended. The face wasn't clear, but there was something about it that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't human. The eyes were empty, like dark pits, and the mouth was twisted into a crooked smile that stretched far too wide. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I knew I couldn't look back again. Something told me that if I did, I wouldn't make it out of there. The voice returned, clearer this time, as if someone were sitting in the passenger seat. "Keep driving. Don't look." My breathing grew shallow, and my stomach twisted into knots. Sweat trickled down my forehead despite the cold night air. I forced myself to obey, keeping my eyes locked on the road ahead, but every fiber of my being begged me to check the mirror to see if the face had truly vanished. Then I noticed something else. The truck felt like it was losing power. The gas pedal was pressed all the way down, but the engine roared uselessly, like something unseen was holding me back. That helpless feeling gripped me entirely. No matter how hard I pressed the gas pedal, the truck kept slowing down, as if it were being held back by some invisible force. The low hum that had replaced the whispers grew louder, vibrating through the cab and into my chest. It wasn't a sound I could place, deep and guttural, like something ancient stirring in the dark. I wanted to stop, to jump out of the truck and run, but leaving the safety of the cab in that dense fog seemed just as dangerous as whatever was following me. My hands were cramping from gripping the wheel so tightly, but I couldn't let go. I couldn't look back. Then, I felt the air change inside the cab. It's hard to explain, but it was as if the space shrank around me, pressing down on my chest. A strange smell started to fill the air, sharp and metallic, like wet earth and rusted iron. My stomach churned, and my head started spinning, but I forced myself to stay focused. That's when I heard it, breathing. It wasn't mine. It was heavy and labored, almost animalistic, and it was coming from somewhere behind me. Every hair on my body stood on end as I fought the urge to turn around. "Don't look, don't look, don't look," I muttered under my breath, clinging to the one rule that might keep me alive. And then I saw something on the road ahead. Through the fog, faint handprints appeared on the asphalt, smeared as if someone had dragged their fingers across the surface. They were spread out, growing clearer and more defined as I drove closer. A cold dread sank into my bones. It didn't feel like a warning, it felt like a trap. The radio crackled back to life, the voice rising above the static, this time louder and more urgent. "Don't look back, he's here." My heart nearly stopped. For the first time in my life, I considered jumping from the moving truck, abandoning it entirely. But curiosity, or desperation, got the better of me. The question, "What's here?" echoed in my mind, over and over. My vision blurred from the panic, but I pressed forward, refusing to stop. For a brief second, though, my eyes darted to the side mirror. It wasn't the same face as before. This time, it was a full figure standing on the truck's trailer, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes that shone like distant headlights in the darkness. I snapped my eyes back to the road, but the truck lurched violently, as if something had climbed into the cab with me. I nearly lost control of the truck when I felt the weight of something inside the cab. The metallic smell grew overwhelming, and the air was so thick I could barely breathe. I didn't dare look to my side, but the presence on the passenger seat was undeniable. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst, and my hands were slick with sweat, slipping slightly on the steering wheel. Then I heard it again, not from the radio this time, but right next to me. The same raspy, distorted voice whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." A chill ran down my spine, and in that moment, I was certain I wouldn't make it out alive. The figure began to speak more, but the words were nonsensical, a garbled mix of languages or sounds that didn't seem human. With every word, the truck shuddered, as if the vehicle itself were reacting to the presence. My vision blurred, and the strange guttural sounds echoed in my skull, making my head throb. That's when I saw it. A small turnoff ahead, barely visible through the fog. It was a rest area, one I'd never noticed before, but it felt like my only chance. Without hesitation, I yanked the wheel hard, pulling the truck off the road and into the narrow clearing. The truck came to a jarring stop, nearly sliding off the edge. The presence in the cab didn't move, but the air vibrated around me, threatening to explode. I killed the engine, and as the truck fell silent, the stillness around me was deafening. My breaths came shallow and quick, and I sat frozen in my seat, unsure of what to do next. I wanted to run, but something told me that opening the door would mean surrendering to whatever was out there. I grabbed the only thing I had, an old flashlight I kept on the dashboard, and slowly turned to face the passenger seat. It was empty. The cab was completely still, and the metallic smell had vanished. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. But then, I glanced at the side mirror. The trailer was smeared with bloody handprints. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding back onto the road and cutting through the fog as fast as I dared. I didn't look back, not even once, even when the radio started crackling again. The last words I heard through the static before it fell silent haunt me to this day. You escaped this time, but he always comes back. Since that night, I've refused to drive alone through the Appalachians, and to this day, I avoid looking in my rearview mirror for too long. Some things I've realized are better left unanswered. I've been a trucker for almost 20 years, and let me tell you, if you do this job long enough, you'll see things no one would believe. This happened to me back in 2017, during a run through the Pacific Northwest. It was mid-autumn, and I was hauling a load of industrial equipment to Seattle. I had spent the entire day driving through roads surrounded by dense forests, the kind where sunlight barely pierces through the trees. Taking these remote routes wasn't unusual for me, and I actually enjoyed the solitude. But that night, I wished I wasn't alone. It was around 10 at night when I decided to stop at a rest area. I was tired, my neck was stiff, and I figured some fresh air and a cup of coffee from my thermos would help me push through. The rest stop was small, with an empty parking lot and a couple of poorly lit bathrooms. The kind of place you stop at, but never stay long. I parked my rig, stepped out to stretch my legs, and took a deep breath of the cold air, which smelled faintly of damp pine. That's when I noticed the car. It was an old sedan, maybe from the 80s, with faded paint and dents on the side. It was parked across the lot, its headlights off. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I realized someone was sitting inside. Through the foggy window, I could make out a silhouette sitting in the driver's seat, completely still, almost like a statue. Even so, I brushed it off. Some people just want to be left alone, right? I went back to my truck and tried not to overthink it. I had just opened my thermos when I heard footsteps. They were soft, almost inaudible, but distinct enough to make me freeze. I looked around, but the rest stop was completely silent, except for the occasional rustling of the wind in the trees. Still, the feeling that someone was nearby was impossible to shake. I closed the thermos and climbed back into the cab, locking the door out of instinct. That's when I heard it. A faint knock-knock coming from the back of my truck. For a moment, I froze, my heart pounding as I tried to process what I'd just heard. It's probably the wind, I told myself, trying to stay calm. But the sound was too deliberate, almost like someone had knocked gently with their knuckles on the metal. I grabbed my flashlight from the dashboard and took a deep breath before cracking the cab window open. The cold air rushed in, bringing with it the oppressive silence of the forest. I aimed the flashlight toward the back of the truck, but saw nothing except the mist creeping along the ground. I knew something wasn't right. Normally, these rest stops are deserted at this time of night, especially in such a remote area. But that eerie feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. My eyes drifted back to the old car. The silhouette was still there, but now it seemed slightly different, as if it had shifted position. Maybe it's some kind of prank, I thought, but the unease in my gut told me otherwise. It's hard to explain, but the way that figure sat there felt off, almost like it wasn't entirely human. I decided to get out and check, which, looking back, might have been the worst decision of my life. I grabbed the pocket knife I always carry, just in case, and stepped down carefully, trying to move as quietly as possible. I made my way to the back of the truck, sweeping the flashlight around every corner. Everything looked fine. No signs of anyone tampering with the trailer or the cargo. I let out a breath of relief and turned to head back, but then I saw it. On the side window of the cab, where I had been just moments ago, there were handprints. Large, smeared handprints, as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass with force. That was the moment adrenaline kicked in. I hadn't heard enough footsteps for anyone to get that close without me noticing. Whoever, or whatever, had done that had to still be nearby. Instinctively, I turned back toward the car. This time, the silhouette was gone. The driver's seat was empty, and the door was slightly ajar. My heart was pounding in my ears as my flashlight trembled in my hand. I started backing toward the truck, but that's when I heard it. A low, quiet laugh, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere within the trees. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive away as fast as I could, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. That laugh. It wasn't just unsettling. It was completely unnatural. It didn't sound like something a human could make, but at the same time, it had a mocking tone, as if whatever it was enjoyed my fear. My flashlight was shaking in my hand as I tried to shine it toward the trees, but the beam barely reached through the thick forest. All I could see were shadows, endless pine trunks, and the mist getting denser. "Get out of here, man. Just leave," I muttered to myself, but something kept me frozen there, like I needed to understand what was happening. With adrenaline still coursing through me, I ran to the truck, yanked the door open, and climbed inside, locking it immediately. I pulled the curtains across the cab windows, as if that would somehow protect me, and started the engine. But just as I grabbed the gear shift, something made me stop. I glanced at the side mirror and saw a shadow moving in the mist near the old car. It wasn't a person, I know that for sure. It was tall, unnaturally skinny, and moved in a way that seemed off, almost like it was gliding instead of walking. My heart was pounding out of my chest, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. That's when I noticed something even more terrifying. The shadow stopped moving and turned directly toward my truck, as if it knew I was watching. I could swear I saw something glowing where its eyes should have been, reflecting the faint light from my flashlight still sitting on the dashboard. I couldn't make out a face, just that impossibly tall and terrifying shape staring right at me. And then I heard another noise, banging. This time, it was loud and coming from the passenger side of the truck, as if someone was pounding on the door with their fists. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. That was enough to snap me out of my frozen state. Without thinking twice, I shoved the truck into gear and hit the gas, desperate to get away from that place. My heart was racing, and my hands were so sweaty they kept slipping on the wheel. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. The old car was still there, but the shadow was now standing right next to it. This time, it didn't move. It just stood there, watching as I drove off into the night. Even after I got back on the road, my mind was racing. With every mile I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that thing following me. But the highway was empty, except for the mist that seemed to crawl along the pavement like ghostly fingers. My breathing was heavy, and the silence in the cab only made everything worse. I turned on the radio, hoping it would distract me, but even that didn't help. Every song or DJ's voice sounded muffled, like the sound itself was being swallowed by the same darkness I'd left behind. After driving nonstop for about 40 minutes, I saw a brightly lit gas station up ahead. It looked like a beacon in the middle of that dark, endless stretch of road. When I pulled in, I felt immediate relief seeing other people around. The clerk inside, an older man with white hair and a tired look in his eyes, gave me a curious glance when I walked in, probably because of how shaken I looked. I ordered a coffee and tried to act normal, but my hands were still trembling. He handed me the cup, and just as I was about to leave, he asked casually, "You came through the rest stop on Route 97, didn't you?" My mouth went dry. I nodded, and his expression grew serious, a look that sent chills down my spine. "I wouldn't stop there at night if I were you," he said, glancing out the window like he was checking for something. When I asked him why, he hesitated for a moment before answering. "There are stories, you know, people hearing things, seeing things, and not everyone makes it back to tell about it." My throat tightened. I thanked him for the coffee and left quickly, not wanting to hear any more. But as I climbed back into the cab, I noticed something that froze me to my core. Handprints on the windshield. Large, smeared handprints, just like the ones I'd seen earlier. I wiped them off, trying to convince myself it was just condensation or dirt, but deep down, I knew better. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I avoid that stretch of highway whenever I can, and if I have no choice but to pass through, I make sure not to stop. Whatever was at that rest stop still haunts me, and honestly, I think I'd rather never know what it really was.